Welcome to episode 12, where I talk about attention and cognitive load, all the coolest stuff you've ever wanted to hear about, right? Yay!
You're here because you want more engagement, more delight, more fun, more learning. You're hungry for change and willing to take action.
If you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original.
Welcome to the eLearning Scenario Design Podcast with Anna Sabramowitz.
I'm gonna show you how great I am.
Let's take learning to the next level.
Welcome, friend. I hope you're doing great today. I certainly am, because I get to hang out with you for a little while and work through some thoughts in my head. So yeah, I said cognitive load. And let's really talk about first what cognitive load is. And for that, I will go to one of my, I would say, go-to resources when I first started out in instructional design. And this is a book that I feel kind of spoke to the science nerd in me, because you may or may not know I've got a biology degree. I know, totally weird, right? But I really love science, and this book is very science-based and research-based. It's called eLearning and the Science of Instruction by Ruth Colvin Clark and Richard I believe, is it Mayer? And I love them both. They are fabulous human beings, because I believe that they've really brought a lot of awesome resources. I have tons of Richard's resources on my bookshelf, as well as Ruth's. Ruth also wrote another book, which is called, I don't know exactly what it's called. It's exclusively about scenarios. Now, the version I have of eLearning and a Science of Instruction is, and I don't know if they've even updated it, it's pretty old. It's probably at least a decade old, I think. And you can tell by the screenshots in the book. But one of the things they do is, in this book, which is absolutely fabulous, is, I suggest you pick it up. It's, what they do is they took a whole bunch of studies or things like e-learning situations and designs, and then ran them by an audience and studied how people respond, how people retain, how people understand. And so they used all this data to inform best practices in e-learning. And it's not that I agree with everything, because I think there is always room for iteration and adjustment. However, I think that if you followed some of these principles, or most of them, then you'd get, as far as the design of things, they would be really good guidelines. And if we all worked within these constraints, which I try to, you would actually get better e-learning out there. So one of the things that they talk about here is, let's talk about cognitive load. So it's wonderful. There's actually a glossary at the back of this book, which is just awesome. So cognitive load is the amount of mental resource in working memory required by a task. So what that means is that because you've probably heard this, maybe you haven't, that there's this principle of 5 to 7 or 7 to 9, where we can only hold so many numbers in our head at the same time, or so many pieces of information. And usually that's around between 5 and 7, right? So if apparently that's why phone numbers are only 7 digits long, because that's the amount that we can actually remember at a time to be long enough to dial them, I guess. I don't know if that's actually true. I haven't researched that aspect. But so what that means to us as e-learning developers and scenario developers and designers is that we have to be really aware of what we put on the screen and how many moving pieces there are. And so one of the things that Ruth and Richard talk about in their book is this idea of combining images with text. And that's one of the things that I really like to be very careful about when I'm doing my my scenarios, is that if you're going to have an image that somebody needs to understand, you have to be very careful with how you sequence the audio and the text at the same time. So one of the things you may see is that, let's say you're reading a digital comic book, and I don't know if you've ever checked out something like Comixology, which takes current comics, and actually I think you can even do a subscription, and you basically can read the comic books on your iPad, which is awesome because then you can take your entire comic book collection with you everywhere. The comic books are beautiful. A lot of them are digitally remastered, obviously, and I think a lot of them are obviously being already made digitally, so they're beautiful to look at, but also it saves trees, and I live in a place where saving trees is really, really important. So we've got this this cognitive load, and so what that also means is that if you have information on the screen, and some of it is asking you to visually understand information, like a diagram, and some of it is asking you to understand information through your auditory, what do they call it? It's paths, right? Visual paths, auditory paths. And so there's only so much information that goes through one path and the other. And if you start overlaying things, like, let's say you have, let's say you try to do these things. You have an image, and then there's text that needs to be read. And at the same time, that text is being narrated by somebody. Now, what happens is in that case, because you have an image you have to understand and text you have to visually understand, and also you have to understand something through your audible path, then what happens is one of those gets missed. Or, as far as I'm concerned, I think all of those get done at a level of, let's say, instead of having a visual path and then somebody walking you through narrating what's supposed to be happening in the image, or let's say you have a block of text and somebody's reading that out to you, so you're basically, once again, visually processing those symbols, which are words, and then listening to them. That's something that you can actually do. But if you have an image that you have to understand, text you have to read, and also text you have to process through your ears, what happens is it gets lost. And the comprehension goes down. And actually, there's several examples that are listed in the book, very good visual examples of how to structure images and text to help you understand what's going on in the actual image. And what's actually really neat, and I don't know if comic books realize this, but when you look at it at a picture, and if the words are integrated right in the picture, it actually enhances the understanding. And when you think about, most comic books, whatever's happening, the text, the descriptions are integrated right almost into the image. So the image is very close to the text. So it helps you understand at the same time. So basically, what I'm saying is that if you have an image and you have text at the same time, don't add another layer to it, like narration. Either choose to have the text there beside the image very close so that people can understand and process it slowly because they're not going to be able to process both at the same time through the visual stream. So basically give them a chance to alternate, because if you to add to that mix another audio component, it will overwhelm them. And the one thing that I found, and why am I talking about this, is because I'm working on a project, and there seems to be, how, and this happens, right, where people who have Well, we've all gone to school. We've all maybe, sorry, taking a sip of my coffee here. We've all maybe seen or studied things online, watched a YouTube video with closed captioning, blah, 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 right? And so what we assume is that we represent our learner, and what we assume is that somehow we now know how to design good e-learning scenarios. And I'm not saying that a person who does that for a living is not good at that. However, the problem is that people, and I mean, I fall in that boat. I make assumptions about my learners, and the assumptions are based on anecdotal experiences. So imagine this: we're having a conversation about it's an interactive comic book that we're designing right now, and there was a conversation about this ancient scroll coming in, and somebody not only reading that scroll to the audience in the comic book, but also then showing an animated version of that scroll opening up, and there's a person beside it who's like trying to maybe enact some of the things that are happening in it. And this is all supposed to happen at the same time. And so I said, no, that's way too much. Like, that's so much info. It's just like nobody's going to get any of that. Whether we're enacting what's happening in the scroll, we're opening up the scroll, we're reading what's happening in the scroll, and the scroll is actually a historical account of something. The scroll is supposed to represent an actual mandate, and now we're having people listen to it. That's just too much. And so this person says in the room, well I like to read and and have the words pop up for me at the same time. And then somebody brought up the Star Wars kind of intro, right? Because you've got the music, dun, 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 right? And then the words come in, you know, those big yellow words on the screen, and they're moving, and you can read them, right? And the music's, you know, in a galaxy far, far away, something like that. So people are looking at that as an example of what you should do, what's entertaining, what you should do in e-learning. And the key word there is entertaining. So it's kind of funny because during those moments you have to really, you have to be very careful about how you say those things, how you, not how you say them, it's how you mitigate that kind of conversation. So there's several ways, right? One of the things you can do is bring up the facts. And the facts are, that doesn't work. And if somebody, and they will, bring up an experience of Star Wars and how they read and listened to music and things were moving at the same time, what's the problem there? That's entertainment. Also, has anybody ever remembered anything beyond the in a galaxy far, far away? Like, honestly, has anybody ever remembered the text beyond that? No, it stays potentially in your memory at that very moment. Also, when you think about moving text, music, and the fact that you're supposed to read, you have music, but the music is familiar, and therefore it does not distract you from the reading. So you have to be very careful, you know, to examine the context in which that information is being shared. So that's one piece. And then the other piece that I learned I have to be very, when you're working with people who are all coming in with their own ideas, is that you have to set the constraints up front for those projects. So maybe at that point, I feel like what I should have done is, before we even got to that conversation, is set some ground rules and constraints and that are built into the template itself. Because let's not kid ourselves, starting a project from a blank slate is very inefficient and most times extremely unnecessary. So it's almost like, you know, opening yourself up to a can of worms, because now everything, and let me tell you, with a team of, let's say, and I've worked on a team with where we've had like 12 subject matter experts. or two experts that don't agree on something, and then they're also figuring things out as they go along, and then we get feedback from 12 more experts to review their work because they're not really confident about their work. And actually academia works this way a lot, is nobody's sure about anything. They really want to investigate it, and that's fine, except not during a project that you're trying to meet deadlines on. And also so really in that situation where you have these differing anecdotal inputs coming through, a book like eLearning and the Science of Instruction will be good for you to use as your kind of like Bible, if I can say that. It's not, but it will actually help you if you haven't set those rules up front and baked them into your activities and templates. So cognitive load, there's that. There's, it's kind of neat because I haven't heard this term in a long time, and it's called cognitive interest, which Ruth and Richard say is a source of motivation stemming from a learner's ability to make sense of the instructional materials. So as a result of understanding the lesson, the learner experiences enjoyment. Enjoyment! That's a cool word. And so contrast this with emotional interest. So there's cognitive interest, which is like, I'm getting it. There's a good feeling there. That's great. And then let's see emotional interest. So emotional interest is a source of motivation stemming from treatments that induce arousal in learners, such as, get this, dramatic visuals or stories. Contrast this with cognitive interest. See also seductive details. Ooh, Ruth, now you've got me hooked. Seductive details. Let me see this. Here it is. It's kind of weird because each one of these definitions so far has been, if you like this, check out this definition. And I've gone down the rabbit hole with you. I hope you're enjoying it. So here's back to the book here. Seductive details. Text or graphics added to a lesson in order to increase the learner's interest, but which is not essential to the learning objective. I would say that seductive details are supposed to be used extremely judiciously, because if we just focus on the emotional interest and the cognitive interest alone, remember what we said about emotional interest. Induce arousal in learners, such as dramatic visuals or stories. And the emotional interest, to me, is almost the emotional investment that somebody would make, right? And I know. And feeling is knowing, isn't it? That emotional interest really is a way for us to entice somebody to continue learning. So cognitive interest is when we, it really talks about engagement. I haven't thought about it this way before, but I always think about engagement and engagement strategies, and how there are strategies that are, I call them shallow and deep, and a lot of people refer to them as intrinsic and extrinsic, and extrinsic kind of fall in the way of shallow. And to me, those are things that, let's say, engagement strategies. And when I say engagement strategies, I mean, let me get really clear on this. When I say engagement strategies in e-learning or scenario design, I mean things that help people get interested in completing it to the end. So engagement strategies are things like, let's say on an e-learning module, you can have a progress bar. To me, that's an engagement strategy. It's a shallow engagement strategy because it's very much like a visual kind of a tick, like a check mark. But it is, if combined with others, it actually can serve as a piece of a motivation to help you continue going. So if you look at new software now, something like Articulate Rise, they have the, not only do they have the bar, the progress bar built into the top, and it's built in. I believe you can turn it off, but I wouldn't, because why? It's like an extra bonus that you can use. So you've got the progress bar, it actually happens at the top, and if you use the sidebar menu, it actually has these little circles that fill in as you work through your content. So it's wonderful. They were like, yeah, let's bake this in, and I love the fact they did because it works. It's a very clear visual indicator of progress. So it's we don't maybe think about it this way, but it is an engagement strategy, because without it, it's almost like you can see how far you've come along, and it gives you a bit of sense of accomplishment. Unless you've created some giant resource. I don't know if you've ever been in this situation, but I have, which is when you go into an e-learning module and it says you're on slide 3 of like 342. You know, sometimes like in the older modules, it used to give you like a slide count. Oh God, that was actually an anti-engagement strategy, as far as I'm concerned. So there's one engagement strategy. Another engagement strategy is giving people like a good work or a checkpoint. Like let's say as they complete things, you give them like a yay, you did it. So that's another shallow engagement strategy tactic, where you give them a big check mark, and it's juicy, as Ryan would call it. Ryan, my partner. So Ryan really focuses, like he's deconstructed a lot of these strategies that are more on the shallow end. I would say, I mean, he might not agree with me, but and this is done mostly through things like I mean, you can deconstruct a lot of those learning games, like if you've ever looked up things like Lumosity or Elevate, which are quote unquote, because it's super light and not true, that would probably make another podcast, games that are supposed to train your brain and increase your cognitive processing abilities. Basically what they've been trying to tell you is that if you practice something on an iPad or your phone or your computer, which is something like let's say there's skills like spatial skills, some like word processing skills and puzzle solving skills, maybe the things that you'd find on your typical IQ test, that what they've said that if you study these things and get better at these skills through the games that Lumosity and let's say Elevate has set up, that you would be able to take that cognitive aspect that you've built up now through these games, and it will affect your cognitive abilities in other areas, as in you'll be now almost like a visual puzzle master, and you'll be able to apply that to other aspects of your life. The problem with that is that it hasn't actually, there's no conclusive studies that this is true. It will improve, naturally, you'll get better at the games within that software, so you'll get better at solving them, but that's like saying, and I think studies have been done on the fact that, playing Tetris all day does not actually make you a better, I don't know, bricklayer. Maybe. I don't think there's actually been a correlation made. There have been other correlations made about the fact that the more you play a game like Tetris, the less your brain actually ends up working as you get better, because the tasks, as they get more automatic, even if they get more complex, they become a part of obviously something that becomes more of an automatic skill. So one of the things that it proves is that you can take something very, very complex, and if you study it over time, especially a skill, it becomes an automatic skill, kind of like we've seen in driving. New driver, completely overwhelmed, so many things to take care of. Somebody who's been driving for 10 years or 20 years, that task becomes so ingrained, and checking for different things and driving safely becomes so ingrained that you can drive and not even know that you've been driving, right? You get that, like, how did I get here? But you've been driving safely, you didn't cause any accidents, but that becomes a very automatic skill for you. But that practice is inherent in the skill. I doubt that you could drive a vehicle in a simulation, like on your computer with a mouse, and that it would actually it would transfer the same skills. I'm not saying it's not possible, but knowing that helps us also with, when we think about scenario design, and we think it all has to be like immersive, real world stuff. Realistically, when you think about the transfer of skills, yeah, when you think about the transfer of skills, the only way you could really have that simulation work properly in an immersive environment is if you actually, I think, physically were immersed in that environment as well. So when you think about scenarios and designing scenarios, you're really trying to think about what is it that if I have all these skills that somebody has to build before they hit, let's say, the real environment where they might hurt somebody if they mess it up, you would never rely on that environment completely to build best practices, because, excuse me, even some of the things that I've seen that Michael Allen has done, and he's done some really pro environmental simulations. Like, I've seen a couple of kitchen simulations that he's built. I don't know, it was a big chain, and they have a very basically baked model for their kitchens, which is, I could see, like, when you have a McDonald's, like, the kitchen layout is probably set up for maximum efficiency, and you just don't mess with that system. So then training for McDonald's, even if you wanted to create a visual simulation where somebody pulls in food and is told when to do that and what sequence, that would be very close to the final environment. However, you would never be comfortable saying, oh, you went through 5 hours of simulated clicking on the mouse through the kitchen. Go for it. Go and make a burger in the real kitchen. No freaking way. Like, that person would probably burn themselves very badly, I would think, because there's a lot of hot things I hear in a McDonald's kitchen, and most things are double hot on both sides and stuff. So I've heard some horror stories. And it isn't to say anything about McDonald's, but just the idea that there is the difference between reality and what we're trying to simulate with a mouse in a seat is completely different. So that's why I always say, let's focus on the mental tasks and the overwhelm of that environment, so that when that person enters that environment, there are some elements that are already familiar. It gives them, if in effect, it actually, what it does is it builds up their confidence a little bit to not be too scared. So let me tell you what I mean. So if I was training somebody to work in a, let's say, a kitchen, and they were putting through orders, and the idea is not even how to how to cook those things. Let's say at the very beginning, because I don't think you actually learn how to cook things unless you're actually cooking things. But let's say there's a simulation that Michael Allen's put together where he realized, and very, very rightly so, is that one of the things that they could do with e-learning scenarios is not simulate how to make scrambled eggs, but when you have an order that comes in of 6 things, one of the things that usually cooks mess up on, let's say, that we could actually tackle in an e-learning scenario is looking at the order and recognizing which things should go first. And I don't know if you've ever cooked with anybody who's like a novice, but that's the difference between, I think, a somebody who's a seasoned cook versus a novice cook. Is a novice cook, when they're making dinner, they'll start everything at the same time. So then either something's burnt at the end because it took way long, or it cooked way too long, or something's tough, or something's cold because they started the macaroni and the roast beef at the same time, right? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then that means you're a novice learner. That means you probably, if you've ever cooked a dinner where there's like 3 different dishes that needed to be combined, you probably know this, and you're like, how come this is cold and this needs another 20 minutes, right? So that's cool, because when you realize that this is kind of that recognition piece is something that you could actually really easily create an activity for in e-learning, then the rest of that pressure to like create some really fancy simulation falls away, because all you have to do now is maybe realistically recreate what a food order looks like, which is text. Present that to the learner, present 3 of those and say, well, first, maybe if somebody's new to cooking, you present the first one and say, okay, here you have 4 items. Select the one that goes first, second, third, and fourth, right? And then instead of saying, that's right, you could actually show them, if they do things in this order, a picture of what the food will look like if the order is followed in this way. Now that to me is the best way to show those consequences, because even if, let's say you show them the picture of the food. So I have an order that comes in and I decided to cook the bacon first, the beef last, and whatever. And then I have a picture of what that dish looks like. From my perspective, it looks good, right? And so what you could do is take it one step further. How would you, let's say the bacon is fine, but something is really cold or undercooked because you had to get it all out at the same time. What's a good way now that you could actually teach somebody that whatever they put out, even though it looks good, does not meet criteria or standards? What are some ways we could do that? Well, one way would be you show them a picture of the food and you're like, oh, that looks great. And they're like, oh, look, I did it. I did the right thing. Now, the next step is send it to the table. You send it to the table, and we still don't tell them if it's right or wrong. They've looked at it and they're like, okay, visual assessment looks okay, but what's the real test? Somebody eating that food, right? What do? We send it to the table, and the waiter comes back with, and all of this can be done via text, right? Oh, the waiter came back, and here's what the customer wrote you a personal note. The spaghetti was hard, and this was disgusting. I can't believe you served this kind of food. What happened? You were able to then do several things. One, they got feedback through consequences, right? Which is important. Also, they got it before they hurt anybody or they pissed anybody off because they served them a bad meal. And also, what you did is you were able, through the scenario, one of my favorite things is to compress time and also to compress time and also to prepare them mentally for some of the visual things that would happen. So let's say you showed a picture of a meal that actually had one of the items is burnt. I mean, you could easily do that. Like basically, if somebody picks where the bacon is always the first thing they cook, and we know that that's wrong because bacon burns really fast, then what we can do is have an actual picture, take the time to shoot what it takes of a meal where the bacon is burnt and it's evident, and that's a really easy visual cue for somebody. So what we're doing there is we're compressing time as well, because sometimes what happens is somebody will put out something like a product, and they don't see the effect of that product over time, and what happens is they then don't connect the what they did with the result. So that's one of the, and it's kind of funny because you got to think about this in this context. You know how sometimes people, and I don't know if this was actually useful in any way, and I don't know why people believe this, but I don't know if you can relate to this. I remember when I was little, and we had dogs. And I never actually saw this, but everybody always had this thing that if you came home and the dog had pooped in your house, that you were supposed to rub his nose in it so that he'd never do it again. And see, I actually believed this was true. I never did it. I never saw anybody do it, but we had dogs, and if they ever pooped in a house, we would I never actually remember any dogs pooping in the house, but let's just say there was this common, which is, there's wrong with the word common knowledge because there's no such thing, but this was kind of what people said. So the idea was that somehow your dog, even after you came home after 8 hours of being at work because you decided to lock him up and he had no place else to be pooping, imagine holding poop for 8 hours, by the way. So that's, to me, that's just like the epitome of like really cruel, thinking. It's just not logical. So the dog poops in the corner, and somehow when you come home and you get pissed off at him because now you have to clean this up, which you should be pissed off at yourself, honestly, because you let a dog go that long that he had to poop in the house. But that dog, when you rub his face in the poop, he's supposed to remember that poop came from his butt, and also that 8 hours ago he shouldn't have done that. So there's just no logical connection. That's why when you're training dogs, you're supposed to either use it clicker or treat, because you want to connect a behavior, because dogs lose it, right? You want to connect that behavior almost immediately to either a treat or a good consequence, because what it does is it reinforces the behavior because they're able to connect the behavior to the outcome. And I'm not saying that people are dogs, because they're not. However, when we're talking about, behavior conditioning, what we're trying to do with our scenarios is actually help people make connections, right? And it's not that people won't draw those connections on their own, because they will. We are actually expecting that they will, because we are not telling them anything. We are showing them through consequences. And when I say showing, it can also mean a note from a customer, right? So we're not showing everything. It doesn't have to be high production. It can actually just be the outcome of what happened without any kind of explicit instruction. The instruction is through our careful selection of the consequences. I don't think we realize this enough, is that our consequences are feedback, but they're in the form of a consequence, which is a better lesson. And so one of the things you can do is when you give those consequences, and this comes back to, believe it or not, cognitive load that I was talking about, is that you've now created the opportunity for somebody to experience something, which is that consequence. And now they're connecting a sequence of food to what the food now looks like, and now what the food will taste like for somebody else. So when my fabulous human being that has gone through this training in eLearning and gone through all these scenarios where they've had to manage multiple orders, and now things are coming in maybe at a rapid pace, and they've started to see a pattern of things in their mind. There's a bit of a pattern. When they hit the live kitchen, they might actually, all of that might go completely out the window. Kind of like, when people study and then all of a sudden for an exam, and then all of a sudden they show up to that place and they just draw a complete blank. And it's not that they don't know, it's because they're so stressed out that all that emotionality, in fact, takes over, and they blank out. And I've had this happen to students. I know they were amazing students, and then what happens is this pressure of the situation is actually makes them forget everything that they studied. That's why I think exams are actually one of the worst things in the world, because they don't replicate real life, or they amp up the pressure so badly that it actually is a detriment to this person's thinking. Like recalling facts is in a high stress environment is ever going to be something that a biologist needs to do, right? And that's the kinds of education that I had, which is study hard and then be put into this basically pressure cooker and then regurgitate it all. It's just not cool. So I always think about that when a person who has, let's say, never been in one of those big industrial kitchens where everything is automated, you have to stay out of people's way, everybody's moving really quickly, and everybody's got a rhythm and a place, and now you're entering that space. And it's super intimidating, right? So what will happen for some people, not everybody, but for some people, they'll be extremely intimidated by that environment. It'll be a cognitive overload because there'll be, I'm sure, more than 7 things going on. And when I say 7 things, it's not like 7 discrete things, like everything's coming at you at the same time. It's like you ever seen a baby go out or a cat go out who's always been outside? Like they don't even know where to look because everything's too much. And that's how we are in a new environment. So a lot of times you will put that person there, they will have forgotten everything. Then, once they get a little bit more comfortable with that environment through repeated exposure, then what might happen if we did our e-learning right is that as they start touching and handling some things and the cognitive overload of where they are and what they're doing falls away as things become more familiar, those patterns that we reinforced in the e-learning will start to shine through. And if we attach them to the right things, like if we attached them to things they already knew about cooking, or we helped them create almost a scaffold of understanding that they attach to other experiences in their lives, those things will start to come through slowly and slowly and slowly. So what will happen is the first time they see that chit, and if it looks or it has a sequence that we saw back in the training, they might be like, oh, this looks familiar. That doesn't mean that they'll be just as good at that task as when they mastered it in the e-learning module. But what will happen over time is there probably will be moments of recognition that will help them cope a little bit better. So there's, I saw these simulations, the virtual reality simulations that NASA does for their, it does for its astronauts, right? And I was looking at that, and it's super immersive, right? These guys are actually, guess what? When they're doing those simulations, a lot of times, I think all of the times actually, what they have to do is they're actually wearing their gear, because in the simulation, even though you're moving through space and you're wearing these like VR goggles, everything is different because you're doing it through like these super thick gloves, right? So it's a different feeling. So they're trying to simulate that feeling while they wear this stuff. So they're trying to bring you as close as possible to that environment. And they actually apparently used to do it in a pool underwater so you could feel how that movement would go, because it's different. But the problem is that, let's say with a space station, things change so quickly that in order for you to actually have training that's relevant, you'd have to constantly be rebuilding and adding pieces, and it's very time intensive and expensive, right? So what they did is obviously duh, makes sense. They invested in a really heavy-duty virtual environment, and that's why they are the leaders in that, because out of necessity, right? Necessity is the mother of all invention. I don't know who said that, but I really like that quote. So this is cool, you're looking, and here it is, you are in, and I think you can actually look up YouTube videos of people going through this training, right? Super cool, great. And then I thought, okay, there's no way that anybody would ever be ready, obviously, for a spacewalk after being in that simulation. The only thing they might get a feeling of is how difficult and bulky it is to work in those big, thick suits. And potentially one of the things is, I think, where it would be most useful is that over time you become, because you're cognitively, it's probably extremely stressful to be out there. What you're trying to do is create a pattern where you recognize certain motions. So you can almost say, okay, it's going to be 6 rungs up, 4 to the left, then you grab this, then you grab that. So what you can do is attach a visual pattern to maybe a pattern in your head. And I don't know how they do that, but I was thinking that the other thing that happens with VR is I get the simulation piece. It's very intensive in those situations, but for everything else, it might be overkill. Because think about this. I was actually a couple of weeks ago, and I got this. I actually have a VR headset, and it's not what you think. It's basically, if you've seen a virtual reality headset made by, I think it's Google. It's called Google Goggles. They're made out of cardboard, right? And so what happens is they're cardboard holders with these eye pieces. They look like kind of like these bottle glasses. You can't really see through them very well, not initially, anyways. And then what happens is you download an app on your phone that splits the screen in two. Your phone screen splits it in two. You pop this phone into in front of these glasses, and what happens is through the two lenses that you're looking at, it creates a 3D-like environment. And then what happens is it also responds to your head movements, so you can look 360 degrees around you. And everybody's saying, "Oh, this is so cool! You can use it to immerse a person in an environment." And I'm like, yes, certainly you can. However, what you still have to take into consideration is cognitive load, because in those environments, there's still a lot going on, and our cognitive load does not increase in any way. That doesn't mean that whatever people tell you that our attention spans and all that jazz has changed. No, you can still be very good at focusing on things and executing on things. However, the one thing you have to understand is that when you're putting people into a virtual environment, the richness of that environment will actually take away from the learning experience in some ways initially. And I say this because we have to now think about what is entertainment versus what is education. And remember how we even talked about initially about the idea that when you're watching Star Wars and you're having the music play in the background and you have the text scroll through in a galaxy far, far away, and they tell you the rest of the story as that text is moving on the screen. Nobody remembers what happened after in a galaxy far, far away, and also that is an entertainment piece. So in a virtual environment or any scenario, you want the extraneous stuff to fall away become so familiar that nobody's thinking about it, and they can now focus 100% on the task at hand. So even in Michael Allen's scenarios about the kitchen, when you first look at the simulated kitchen environment, which basically is the cooktop with all these different pieces, and then there's all these tools, or not tools. Yeah, there's tools, but there's also a big kind of a, like where you'd get your ingredients from, kind of like these little buckets of ingredients, and then the plate that comes in, that leaves, and the ticket with the food order. Initially, just you getting the lay of the land is like, whoa, this is a lot of stuff. I don't like 15 buttons, right? So initially, you have to even help the person very slowly get used to where everything is, so that can drop away as far as load. They can now start moving that from the front of their brain to the back of their brain, or bottom of the brain, whatever. I know there's a place that goes. I'm sorry, I don't have the actual geographic location in your brain. I should look that up too. But anyways, so what happens is once we move that from the front of the brain, that mechanical, where the heck am I stuff, cognitive load, to the back of the brain, then we can actually start learning things. So a part of it is, how can we facilitate that to be faster? And it could be something like, one, you create an interface that does not change at all. You don't add any extra buttons for no particular reason, or whiz-bang things. When we talked about what Ruth said about in her glossary about that, what did she call it? I think she called it some kind of sexy details or something like that, right? Seductive. Sexy, seductive, whatever. Interest pieces are questionable to me, especially in an environment like that. So I watched going back to my story. So I have these VR goggles, right? And so the Google goggles are made out of cardboard, and they kind of sit like glasses on your face, and you can see the world 360 degrees. You pop your phone in there. Mine are almost exactly the same, except they're made out of this like soft foam. They're bright purple, which makes them super cool. So you still pop your phone in the front, and it just has like these straps that go around your head. So the goggles, as if you're looking action or moving around, they don't fall off your face. That's the only difference. That was the $80 difference, because you can get Google glasses now for like, not glasses, the VR viewers, you can get them for like $5. So there's no excuse why you shouldn't go on a virtual safari with like a National Geographic guide for free. So you should check it out. It's amazing. Anyways, so I'm checking it out. I'm looking at this thing, and it's I think it was a Google VR special that they had right on their, the Google main page. And it was about, I believe it was about a magician or something like that. Oh, no, it was about the guy who basically, I think, revolutionized cinematography. And I think it was him who created that special effect where you have all these people going to the moon, and then the moon gets like a rocket in its face because they land on it, and the moon's made out of like... Anyways, he's the one who actually created all those pieces, I believe. So I'm watching this VR. It's beautifully decorated. There's all like, you're basically in a theater watching this magic show or something like that. And it's all like animated. There's no real people there. And I found that because I was amazed by this space I was in, as I think most people are when they're like in a grand opera house, you always like look around, right? So that's what I did. I looked around. And there was lots of things going on even behind me, even though the lights were dimmed. There was all these things everywhere, and I found them really interesting. And then by the time because what happens when you start playing this thing, the show starts playing in front of you as if you are at this magical opera house or whatever, theater. And then by the time you look back, because you're supposed to, as he moves through the stage, you follow him along, I lost parts of the narrative because I was distracted by all the things around me. And it reminded me of my experience when I went to a circus show in Vegas, the first one, Cirque du Soleil, and I believe it's called Mystère. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I know there's a cool French saying for it. So I'm thinking about how, and I remember being in that show, sitting as a part of the audience, and one of the things that happens is it's supposed to entertain you, right? But also delight you and surprise you. And so what happens is there's a lot of things that are going on at the same time. While there's things going on stage, there's things happening all around you. And once in a while, you'll see some movement, and then you see that the walls are crawling with people and they're off to the side. It's like just really freaky and awesome. But one of the things I felt is that there were so many things going on at the same time that I missed out on some things. And that was just for fun, right? So imagine your learner now. It's not that we have limited focus as far as time. It's that we have limited focus as far as scope. So, the whole idea of multitasking. So the more variables you add to your scenarios as far as click this is glowing and turning, now I'm listening, now there's music, all those things just strip away focus. They're like, I can only focus on one thing at a time. Are you helping me do that? So if let's say one of the things is that your interface is fairly complicated, or that they have to get to learn to know an interface that is complicated, like a kitchen, let's say, then the first couple of lessons or attempts are really there to get that person familiar with that space. And maybe that's what you expect, is the first part is for somebody to actually get comfortable enough to not have to think about where things are in the kitchen, let's say, or if you're training them on how to use a tool, or you're training them on how to use a workspace, that they become very comfortable where things are. And maybe a first couple of the activities is them just doing very meaningful tasks, but the tasks are very forgiving, because what you're doing is you realize that the first part is not about them doing the task well, but figuring out where things are so they can cognitively drop them. Like when you're teaching somebody how to drive a car, maybe the first thing you think about is not getting to a certain place, but having them know which is the brake and which is the gas, right? Or what are the boundaries of their car before you actually have them fully park it, that they actually know where the back end ends and things like that. So really have to think about these things, which is that there's different paths for listening, and there's different paths for looking. So visual and auditory are separate, and there's one path for each. So you can only understand symbols and listen to something. You can't understand symbols, understand an image, and listen to something at the same time and be able to do that all at the same time. So what I'm saying is if you're going to have narration, and I think the reason I think we're going there, like when we have things that are almost cognitively overloaded, is because we're trying to meet the needs of multiple kinds of learners, right? So what happens is I'm trying to meet the needs of people who maybe need to hear it versus need to read it, or people who can't hear it but need to read it. So what we should be thinking about is, first, think about what the experience would be like. And I get this is about compliance and things like that, but you have to think about one person's optimal experience at a time. Because when you smush it all together, you're actually diminishing the experience for people who, if I can read, listen, see, all those things, you're actually diminishing the experience for me because you're asking me to focus on so many things at the same time. So think about what the experience is like for that person with a cognitive load, the 5 to 7 items, right? What are they? Don't mix up the channels, right? Don't ask me to put too much on my visual channel and then too much on my auditory channel. So if you're playing text or if you're narrating something, don't put music in the background at the same time, because that's two things you're asking my ears to process, my brain to process. So if somebody's talking, make the music almost invisible. If I'm listening to music, then just put maybe pictures on the page. Or if there is text, get rid of make the picture static. So it's just those are things that you don't have to explore this and test it all out, because there are things that are better than others. And you may not be able to tell what those things are, because the reason is because once you're building those things, that interface becomes intuitive to you because you've designed it. So you know where everything is. For somebody else, it might be the first time they've ever been in there, right? And they have no clue what you're talking about. It's kind of like when people join Skype for the first time. Like, there's 3 buttons on Skype, but because they're now trying to listen to you, trying to turn on their mic, trying to then share something, it's like you see them, their brain just go bloop, melt, right? Because if they've never done it, they don't even know where to look. So imagine that. And I hope that helps you a little bit. So just stick to designing something for a single learner at a time, and then say, okay, well, let's say this person can't read this, but they can only hear it, or they can't hear it, but they can only read it. Okay, let's swap out that path. Let's swap out this option and say, if this is the kind of learner you are, this is what you should check out. If this is the kind of learner you are, maybe what's more beneficial for you is an actual, just a responsive web page that reads very well, and has some good images embedded, because listening is maybe not an option. Or maybe listening is an option. Let me turn this into a really good scenario with images and over with the consequences coming up as something that, let's say, a customer would say instead of something a customer would type. So I hope that was helpful. Thanks for sticking around with me to help me work through all these ideas together, and then think about how even today, because there's so many tools and whiz-bag things available to us, that we have to be careful about what we borrow from these other places, like movies, like multimedia, like YouTube, how we integrate those things when we're helping people learn, and how we are, in fact, driving focus and attention, how we are controlling that so that people are actually focusing on the right thing instead of the seductive or sexy thing, right? So, have a wonderful rest of the week, and I will talk to you next time, friend. Take care.
You're listening to the eLearning Scenario Design Podcast with Anna Sabramowitz.